Hello everyone, welcome to my monthly Patreon voted review. Shout out to the patrons for being the lifeblood of the channel and keeping this content coming. And I'm very excited to discuss this month's selection, which is Radiant Silvergun by the legendary Studio Treasure. And I have to say, coming into this review, I had messed around with Radiant Silvergun a little bit in the past, dipping my toes in, so to say, booting it up on the Saturn and on the Xbox 360, but nothing serious. And so in the process of doing this review and learning more about the scoring system and about the level design, about the weapon system, and watching some 1-credit clears, I found my appreciation of the game deepening a lot, and I walked away with a new perspective that I thought would be interesting to share. And if you've heard of it before, at least it'll be entertaining. And so a little bit of a background on myself as a player in case you haven't seen previous videos on this channel. When it comes to shmups, I tend to gravitate much more towards the bullet hell Danmaku cave style of shmup that is fast-paced, dense, dynamic, straightforward but brutal, and pushes you to the limits of your reflexes, essentially the new school style of shmup design. Whereas when it comes to the older school style of shmup design that is more methodical and deliberate, this has been a style that I've struggled to connect to, and it's taken me more time to warm up towards games like R-Type and Gradius. I still haven't warmed up to Image Fight, which is cited as a influence on this game. And so when it came to doing this review of Radiant Silvergun, I was a little bit nervous that it'd end up being a type of review where I could step back and appreciate objectively many of the great game design decisions around the game, but I couldn't personally sink my teeth into it and feel like, yes, this is a game that I love. But I was pleasantly surprised about how unwarranted this fear ended up being, because after a few hours of playing Radiant Silvergun and getting used to the control system and getting used to what the game was asking me to do, I found myself really falling in love with this game. You know, engagements will be announced soon, and I think that even after doing this review, this is a game that I do want to continue to play. I'll probably stream it on the channel, and my goal is to get a 1cc clear of this game and do a commentary video, so keep an eye out for that, because I really connected with Radiant Silvergun a lot, and it is in the running now, I would say, among my favorite shmups that I've ever played and reviewed on this channel. And it does make sense, because as I was playing through Radiant Silvergun, there were so many moments through the game that I thought, hey, this reminds me of ZeroRanger, and I actually had not realized how much of an influence Radiant Silvergun had on ZeroRanger, even though in my interview with the developers, they had directly cited the game as an influence, where I even found myself playing through different boss fights and enemy patterns and realizing, oh, I already know this pattern, I already know how this pattern works, I already know what to do here. I found myself strangely comfortable with the sword after playing so much ZeroRanger and its sword mechanic, though as I'll say in a little bit here, the mechanics are pretty different from one another, but the overall idea and even the layout for the buttons I found, there is just a lot in common between these two games. So fun little bit of advice if you're a big fan of Radiant Silvergun already and you're sort of looking for a sequel. Of course, there's Ikaruga, but there's also ZeroRanger, and of the two, I almost feel like ZeroRanger feels more like Radiant Silvergun than Ikaruga, but Ikaruga is a game and a story for another day. So I want to start off with a little bit of a history of Radiant Silvergun. This isn't going to be a full-on expose or anything like that, but I did do some research and read some developer interviews, because it is interesting for me, being such a big fan of Treasure, what was going through their head when they came up with this shmup, which, from what I understand, is their very first shmup, and one hell of a debut. You know, that's like Super Mario 64 when it comes to a really solid first try at a new genre for an experienced studio. And so when I was reading through the developer interview, they said that at the time they were making this, what ended up happening was Sega was requesting for Treasure to make them an arcade game because they were such a hit on the home consoles. So they thought, hey, let's enter into the arcade market with a shmup, of course. And so they were looking around, and the developers said that when they were looking around at the time, a lot of the shmups coming out were much more influenced from the Toplan style, which basically evolved into the cave style that we all know and love. And he wanted to take a step back, and again was influenced by stuff like Image Fight and Gradius, had a more methodical and just different take on the genre. And he never specifically says this in that interview that I read, but I felt like the idea behind Radiant Silvergun is that whenever we talk about this sort of golden project in shmups, the idea often comes up that what if a developer, took the best elements of a shmup and combined them with the best elements of an RPG to create the ultimate golden shmup that every player in the world will appreciate and love? And in the past, I've thrown around some ideas about how this might look, but after playing Radiant Silvergun, I came to the realization, no, this is pretty much it. This is pretty much the ultimate connection of if you took RPG elements and you put them into the shmup and you did it just right, what you're going to end up with, more likely than not, is Radiant Silvergun. And so I want to start off, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the game design and weapon design and everything, just to point out the elements that I think, if not directly inspired by RPG, at least really solidly remind me of RPG elements. Of course, the way the weapon system works, where the more you use the weapons, the more that you score, you gain points like experience points that actually upgrade the power and strength of your weapon, just like if you're playing an RPG and you're grinding out and leveling up. It works pretty much exactly the same way. And what's interesting about Radiant Silvergun that sets it apart from other shmups that might do something similar, like Battle Garega, where Battle Garega you play through and you gain more weapons and you gain more lives. The difference is in that Battle Garega, the game punishes you for playing for score and makes it harder to survive through the system of rank. However, in Radiant Silvergun, it doesn't work this way. Instead, it's reversed, where if you want to beat the game, if you want to get a more comfortable clear, if you want more firepower and an easier time surviving, you actually want to raise your score, you want to raise your weapon levels, which is something that is not all that common in shmups, because in most shmups, the idea is to punish you for doing these things. That way they can get the more experienced players off the cabinet. But since Treasure were, again, more from the console side of things, and they also made this game with a home console port in mind, they mentioned that in the interview, it would make sense that they would take a more straightforward RPG weapon leveling system in mind. Another thing that's interesting about the weapon system, at least in terms of RPG, is that the more you use the weapon, the more that specific weapon or weapon type gets upgraded. This is actually something that you'll see in certain RPGs. I think Final Fantasy II is one of the most famous examples of this, where the more you use a magic attack, the stronger that magic attack becomes over time, or weapon, or whatever it is. I think that concept, again, is something that you'll see in RPGs that's brought over here. But on top of just the weapon system, another part about Radiant Silvergun that reminds me of an RPG is the level design, where they have you start in stage 3, and then they have you flashbacking to other stages, and you're moving around in time. And then there's this whole story that's built up around the game to support this concept. Again, this is something people have talked about when it comes to shmup. What if the shmup took story more seriously? What if shmups tried to incorporate story elements into the game design and the level design? And of course, there's been lots of different ideas thrown around about how this might work, but I think Radiant Silvergun comes up with a smart solution where the game's story is actually moving you around through the stages in different ways. Of course, it's sort of surface, but in the story mode, they also have interconnecting dialogue that tells you what's going on. And they also include actual animation sequences. So Treasure did not mess around when it comes to incorporating story elements into the game. Again, I've said this many times in the past, I'm not all that into stories, and I didn't sit down and watch the story for the review, and I'm not going to really summarize the story here, but in my impression, it feels like it's heavily inspired by Evangelion, and I'm a big fan of Evangelion, so that's pretty cool. And actually, a fun fact is that the cutscenes, or whatever you want to call them, the story scenes, the animation scenes, were actually created by a studio called Gonzo, which are an offshoot of the studio Gainax that created Evangelion. So there's kind of a direct connection. I also found this with Sin and Punishment. Again, I don't really know what goes on in Sin and Punishment, but just based on the scenarios that the game presents with you, you can definitely feel that the game's telling you a story somewhat akin to Evangelion. And I think that's something that Treasure is particularly good at, incorporating into the gameplay scenarios an underlying narrative that you can pick up on, even if you're like myself and you skip through all the cutscenes and fast forward through as much dialogue and everything like that. But again, this is something that's an extra hook for people who may not typically get into shmups because, you know, they're looking for stories or whatever. So, and also the focus on boss fights feels like the type of thing you run into in RPG, where again, In something like a cave or a bullet hell, you're going to run into a lot of smaller enemies and swarms, and they're going to push you around the screen. And the idea behind this style of shmup design is for you to be able to fight for portions of the screen, and there's a little bit more of a dynamic element there. Whereas with Radiant Silvergun, there is variation of what you're going to run into, but a lot of the scenarios in the game feel very straightforward and scripted, and there's flexibility on how you're going to tackle the bosses and how you're going to use all your weapons, but there's a much more deliberate, focused game design with the levels that feel, again, like you're playing through scenarios in an RPG or something like an RPG, rather than the more free form that you run into with stuff like Cave or Rising. And so, yeah, there's a very unique flavor to this game that, again, I think will definitely appeal to people who don't grasp some of the underlying concepts of bullet hells and danmakus and shmups. But there's also elements of this game that do appeal to these types of players, because there are some straight up bullet hell patterns in this game. And of course, if you're a good shmup player, you're going to be able to make your way through these various boss fights much more easily than someone who isn't experienced in the genre. So it strikes a really nice balance between being a bullet hell and also old school. It's somewhere in the middle. It's also different enough that you're not going to find anything quite like it. And so that's pretty much everything about the background of the game. And so let's talk more specifically about the weapon system and the controls for the weapon system, because this is something that, again, is very unique about Radiant Silvergun. So this game has 6 different weapons, and instead of having you use some sort of weapon switching system that you'll run into in like Radius or something like that, instead what it has you do is each weapon has a binding and a button combination. And so through the use of, I think, 3 buttons, you can do different combinations, or on the Saturn port, you can all bind them to different buttons. You get all these different attacks available at the tips of your finger at any time. However, I would say that while it is cool to just do weapon combinations and not have to use all 6 buttons, what I found myself doing is sort of a hybrid system where some of the weapons I access through button combinations, and others, especially the sword, I just hard bound to a very convenient button. I would recommend that for the sword, because what you'll find is that as you combine weapons on the button layout, how you combine them will actually change what weapon you choose. And so this is a little bit complicated to communicate, but it is important to understand the game. Let's say you're using the straight Vulcan attack, right? And then you want to whip out your sword. If you want to whip out your sword through a button combination, you need to hit, let's say, A on your controller, right, while you're holding down Vulcan. But let's say now you're holding down homing, and you still need to hit the sword. If you hit A again, most likely the sword is not going to come out. Instead, another weapon is going to come out, because that specific button combination is different. So that's why I felt like putting your sword on a dedicated button is going to save you a lot of headache, because unlike the other weapons, the sword tends to be one that you need to whip out pretty consistently, no matter what weapon or scenario you're in. So I would recommend hard binding the sword, but the idea behind the button combination system is very clever. It can be a bit confusing. You actually need to sit down, sort of like a fighting game, and practice out what combinations of buttons you're going to use and how you're going to access them. Once you get a hang of that, though, I absolutely love the control system and the weapon system, because this is what brings the spice to the gameplay that otherwise you wouldn't get. And again, maybe this is why I'm connecting with Radiant Silvergun a little bit more quickly than I have with Ikaruga, because being able to access all these different weapons and play with them and use them, and the game encourages you to switch between them, because in order to level them up and make them stronger, which you want to do, instead of just focusing all your strength on one weapon type, which could probably be a disaster later in the game, you actually do need to swap through the weapons and cycle through them fairly regularly. So I think the way they did the weapon system is absolutely ingenious. I'm surprised more shmups haven't incorporated it. Again, to make it work fully like it is in Radiant Silvergun, I'm sure is not an easy feat, but for the way this game is put together, the weapon system is very, very cool. And I recommend first thing you do when you fire up the game is figure out exactly how to access all the different combinations and the strengths and weaknesses of each and every weapon. So now let's talk about the scoring system of Radiant Silvergun, because there's a lot to unpack here and it's very unique. I haven't seen a scoring system quite like it. So the way this works is that Radiant Silvergun has a chaining system like you'll run into in other shmups, like Ikaruga has a chaining system, Dodonpachi has a chaining system. However, the way the chaining system works in Radiant Silvergun is very specific and unusual. So the way it works is the more you kill the same color of enemy, you'll notice there's 3 different enemy colors, blue, red, and yellow. The more you kill the same color of enemy and not kill other colors of enemies, the more you build up that chain throughout the stage. And so the way this works out, having spoken to other people about the game, from my understanding, is in most stages, the way this works out is kill all the red enemies because they tend to be the most plentiful. They tend to be sort of the main enemy that you go for. I think there are some stages where you want to switch around and maybe kill a different color, but those are a little bit less frequent. And then from time to time, you also want to do what's called a secret chain, which is you kill all 3 colors, but in a specific order. Again, I don't want to really put together a whole scoring guide, but I will say that if you want to score in the game, paying attention to how the chaining system works and just a rule of thumb, again, just trying to kill the same color of enemy throughout the stage is the way to go. And like Dodonpachi, the way it works is, let's say you accidentally kill a blue ship early. That's not as big of a deal as if you were halfway through the stage and you accidentally killed a blue ship. And also same thing with when you get to the end of the stage, it isn't as big of a deal. So that's the primary scoring mechanic of the game, but the game has more scoring mechanics. On top of that, there's also a grazing system that you'll see in Touhou and Danmaku Unlimited 3, where you get close to enemy fire and that ends up giving you points. Other than giving you points, so I don't think the grazing does anything, and also it doesn't look to be as primary of a scoring mechanic as you tend to see in other games with grazing systems, but it does exist. So if you wonder why certain times when you watch replays, people will sit next to the bullets uncomfortably close and sort of follow them around on screen, that's why they're grazing. And then another element of the scoring system is the hidden puppies, hidden dogs. Kind of fun, kind of like hidden medals in Raiden, I guess. And then another element of the scoring system that's much more important, I think, than the puppies, most likely, is the boss destruction bonus. The way this works is whenever you fight a boss, there's sort of this core. If you kill the core directly without damaging other elements of the boss, this tends to be the safest way to deal with the bosses for survival. This is not totally specific to Radiant Silvergun. You'll see this in other shmups. Cave shmups like Ketsui have stuff like this. But another thing about the destruction bonus to keep in mind is that the more you destroy the boss, this is actually going to level you up better because you'll get more points across your weapons. And so while it's painful for survival in the short term, it could actually end up benefiting your survival in the long term, which isn't typically the case with shmups that have boss destruction, where normally boss destruction is purely for points and it usually just is risky for survival. Whereas with this game, because of the leveling system, you do want to, if you can, do good destruction bonuses early on the earlier bosses, if for no reason other than to build up your weapon meter for later on in the game when you're fighting the much tougher bosses. So that's pretty cool. And of course, whenever it comes to boss destruction bonuses, the way it works is the more you fight the boss and destroy its pieces, it tends to start coming up with more aggressive patterns to punish you. And I believe there's a fair amount of boss milking, at least judging by some of the replays that I watch. I'm not sure how extensive the boss milking is, because surprisingly there are not a whole lot of replays of Radiant Silvergun, at least that I could find, and the ones that I did find on the Xbox One leaderboards. So it's a little bit of a mystery to me about how much boss milking this game involves, but I would be willing to guess a fair amount. So speaking of the Xbox One, let's talk about the platforms and how to play this game, because this is an interesting situation. So of course there is the famously expensive and rare Sega Saturn release that many people who probably don't play shmups go ahead and collect because it's very collectible and, again, notorious for being very expensive on the system, even for people who don't play shmups. And I would say that in terms of ports, Treasure do not mess around. They do a great job on their ports, and by all metrics, this seems to be a very solid port. But what I will say is that an unfortunate aspect of the port is it does not seem to have a robust stage select or training mode or anything like that, which can be a bit of a problem for a game like Radiant Silvergun, because how much routing is involved and how specifically you need to practice certain things, and how, getting through these stages isn't exactly a speedy process. And so being able to do a stage select to practice, especially the later game, is pretty critical. This might have been something that I missed on the Saturn port. Maybe it is unlockable, but I didn't see anything like that. Though what is nice about the Saturn port is that it has two different modes, Saturn mode and arcade mode. Arcade mode works as expected, except unlike many releases of its era, Radiant Silvergun does not allow you to just credit feed your way through the game, even in arcade mode. You do get credits, but if you're not playing well, you run out of them, and then you have to replay the game. And I believe the more you play the game, you do end up getting more credits in the reserve, so I'm assuming at some point, if you try and try long enough, you'll get enough credits in the reserve to credit spam your way through the game. I'm not sure, but I would assume so. However, that's arcade mode. Then there is Saturn mode, and the way Saturn mode works is that you're able to save on the chapters, but if you game over, you have to go back to the start of the chapter. So this is a nice little compromise that's going to force you to learn the game, but it's not going to force you to repeat the earlier stages over and over and over. I would say both inclusions are very important, and I would recommend more shmup developers in the future think about maybe adding stuff like this, where you have a story mode and arcade mode that have different continuation systems. And then there's stuff in story mode where they add in the dialogue and everything and sort of try and flesh out what exactly is going on in the game. So that's the Saturn port. Then there's the Xbox 360 port. And what's really cool about the Xbox 360 port is that it adds in the state select that I was talking about, which is a pretty big deal for helping you learn, especially the later game. And so I ended up spending a lot of time on the Xbox 360 port, even though I also am able to play this Saturn port through means by which my Saturn is able to boot things without permission, if you're all catching my drift. Even though I was able to access the Saturn port, I ended up spending most of my time, and you'll see pretty much all this footage on the Xbox 360 port because of its extra stage select options. And it also has other cool extras that you can explore, like an Ikaruga mode if you own Ikaruga as well, as I understand. However, as cool as the Xbox 360 port is, it is not without its flaws. It has two primary flaws. The first flaw is that it has extra input lag. According to my input lag testing in the past, Radiant Silvergun has 3 frames of input lag on the Sega Saturn, and then it has 4 frames of input lag on the Xbox 360. That's not a huge deal, but every frame counts, at least when it comes to this type of game, and 3 isn't perfect, but every frame counts when it comes to this sort of game. And the other problem with the Xbox 360 port, which might be even more of a problem depending on who you ask, is that it is missing slowdown. So the game on the Xbox 360 port is harder than it is on the Sega Saturn because the Sega Saturn has slowdowns during certain difficult patterns and boss fights and everything like that, whereas the 360 port keeps it 60 and it keeps it moving, which, if you have any experience with this type of porting, isn't exactly the best. I wouldn't shun the Xbox 360 port because, again, it has these really neat features like the training mode and everything like that. But that's not the end of it. There's also, of course, emulation. And the thing about emulating Radiant Silvergun is that you basically have 2 options, or I guess 3 options now. You can emulate the Xbox 360 version on Xenia, which is kind of funny, but I don't think all that useful. And when I did it on Xenia, it didn't unlock the full game, though I'm sure there's workarounds for this. But I don't see a whole lot of reasons for emulating on Xenia, but you can do that. And then, of course, you can emulate the Sega Saturn version on Medafin, I think that's how you pronounce it, which runs well and has the same input lag as the 360 port and has save state support, which is really nice. But again, it doesn't really accurately have the slowdown of the Saturn version, at least what I was able to see. And it also is pretty intensive on your CPU, so you need to have a pretty beefy computer to make this work. And also the audio seems to sound a little bit funny, but still a great way of going about it. Then, of course, there's MAME if you want to play the arcade version. This time around, though, I didn't put too much work into playing it on MAME because I think there are some differences between it and the Sega Saturn version, and most people do gravitate towards the console version of this game, which is kind of interesting considering that most of the time it's the arcade version. And so I would say, personally speaking, if you want to practice the game, either do it on the Xbox 360 or do it on Medafin. And if you want to do runs of the game, I would suggest you do them on the Sega Saturn itself. And of course, there's just the question of accessibility, what you have to offer. However, one version of the game that I will steer you away from is the Xbox One port of the Xbox 360 port, or however you want to call that, because while it does look nice and seems to include everything from the 360 port, the problem is that if you play the Xbox One version, it is more laggy than even the 360 port. You get an extra frame of lag on top of the 360 port. So what you end up with is, if you're playing on the Saturn, you get 3 frames of lag, which I think is solid. Then 4 on the 360 original console itself, which isn't great, but it isn't horrible. And then with the Xbox One version, you're ending up with 5 frames of lag, which just feels really slow for this game and fairly unnecessary considering it's exactly the same thing as the 360 port. So I would say overall, just avoid the Xbox One version. While it is cool that it exists, and I did end up paying $15 for the thing to try it out, I would say stick with either the 360 port or the Saturn port. The Xbox One X version or the Xbox One version is just too laggy for my taste. And so with all that said, before we end this review, I want to discuss the graphics and sound of Radiant Silvergun a little bit, because just like the other elements of the game that I previously pointed out, the graphics and sound of Radiant Silvergun definitely lend itself towards feeling like an epic RPG. The soundtrack, for example, was composed by a guy who did a lot of RPG soundtracks previously, and so it has a certain feel that definitely fits in within that genre and makes it stand out within the genre of shmups. And then graphically speaking, what is great about the presentation of this game, and has become pretty iconic for Treasure shmups, is the cinematic flair of the transitions between the stages, of the bosses entering the screen, of the way the backgrounds move and rotate and are more interactive than what you'll see in a lot of other shmups. And of course, this polygonal, razor sharp 3D graphical design is something that's just catnip for my eyes. And so if you're playing on the 360 port, I definitely recommend going for the low res option, I think it's called. And of course, the original Sega Saturn graphics I am very fond of, and there are definitely a lot of points in the game that just the graphical presentation is above and beyond a lot of what you see in the genre. Just a lot of really smart, nice touches, attention to detail. And there's even elements of the game that are very distinctive and stand out and are just creative in the way that Treasure is famous for being creative. Like the boss that you fight that becomes a wireframe, or of course the final boss, which reminds me of an angel from Evangelion, and just the really epic transitions between it dying and becoming its final form. And I don't know, the way they play with screen rotation, the way you move around the screen is very unique. And then there's that boss fight where the screen actually starts rotating. So what's really cool about Treasure when it comes to graphics and visuals and game design is they're able to meld them together in a very direct way where it not only looks cool, but it actually is directly influencing what you are doing and what is happening on screen. Like I said, with like that rotating boss, you have to start paying attention to the way the bullets are moving now as the camera spins, and what weapons and attacks you can use as things are spinning. And it's just Treasure at its finest. And this is a game that I could not recommend enough. And if I had my way, I would love to see this appear in even more robust form in a PS4 M2 port or a Steam port, like they did with Ikaruga, where it's just a little bit more accessible and easier to get your hands on. Because even though you can play it on the 360, there's the issue with the slowdown. Xbox One is too laggy and the leaderboards are kind of meh. And then the Saturn version is great, but even if you played on the Saturn, there's not the modern amenities of a nice training mode or extra modes like you'll get the Ikaruga mode in the 360 port. So yes, I absolutely love this game. I could not recommend it enough, and it is now on my short list for shmups that I want to 1cc and do a commentary video of. Thanks so much for the patrons for suggesting such a cool game that I probably wouldn't get around to reviewing by myself in the near future otherwise. So that's a nice symbiotic relationship that we can have. And yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Adios. So thank you to the $5 patrons: 172 PCT Water, Adam Pearson, Ukshay Wadker, Dingo, Handicapped, Another Joe, Anthony A, Aaron Solis, B. Reality, Ben Win, Borgie 22, Brian Reboot, Brian Shiver, Chris Yuzefovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Choreo, Danielle Savage, Delta Tango 6, Disco Stas Leia, Eric H, Frank Carter, Full Set, Retro Shmupper, Geriatric Donmaku, Hausu, Ilya, Kiwi, JLab, JB RPG, Joe Angelo, John Kelly, Gameboy Gru, K, K2, Kikoman 589, Larridge, Malaise, Mark Toms, Maz, Meher Kalendrian, Minong, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Philip Mason, Portal 63, Raul, Real Skeen, Sketchy Raccoon, SLW, The Boot Rex, The Real Ikuzo, TRM, Sugumo, Yishi, Plasmo, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.